Daniel Crawford had always been a man of structure both literally and metaphorically. As an engineer who had spent years building a career designing bridges and infrastructure, his personal life mirrored his profession, calculated, sturdy, and reliable. Years ago, he had purchased a quiet piece of land in the countryside, far from the bustle of city life. Nestled amidst tall pines and rolling hills, the plot was where he had built his dream, a modest but meticulously designed home, the result of countless weekends spent with his own hands laying each brick, sawing each beam, and pouring every ounce of his passion into its creation. To Daniel, the house wasn't just a building, it was a monument to his independence and a sanctuary from the world's chaos. After completing a long-term project overseas, a lucrative but draining contract in Eastern Europe, Daniel was eager to return to his retreat. 6 months away from the house felt like a lifetime. He had left the property in the care of a close friend, Liam, a retired neighbor who had always been dependable. Liam promised to keep an eye on the place, to ensure that everything remained as Daniel had left it. But Liam had fallen ill shortly after Daniel left, something Daniel only learned much later during one of their sporadic calls. Still, Daniel trusted the quiet rural neighborhood where everyone looked out for each other. He had no reason to think his absence would bring any trouble. As Daniel's car wound its way up the familiar dirt road leading to his property, he felt the tension of months of hard work abroad begin to melt away. The thought of stepping onto his porch, feeling the crisp countryside air, and finally relaxing in the home he'd built was almost enough to make him forget his exhaustion. But as he rounded the last bend, his anticipation froze in his chest. The house was gone. Daniel slammed on the brakes, staring ahead in stunned disbelief. Where his home once stood, there now loomed a massive modern mansion. The sprawling structure was completely out of place against the natural beauty of the surrounding land. High steel fences enclosed the property, a perfectly manicured lawn stretched out in every direction, and a sleek infinity pool sparkled under the midday sun. A construction this large could only have been completed by a professional crew, and it would have taken months of work. Daniel's stomach churned as the realization hit him someone had built this monstrosity while he was away, and it was sitting on his land. Heart pounding, Daniel drove up to the new wrought iron gates that barred access to the property. A camera mounted on the gate pivoted to follow his car's movement, and a private property no trespassing sign was bolted to one of the posts. Daniel stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel, and approached the intercom. He jabbed at the call button. A static-laden voice answered after a moment. "Who is this?" "This is Daniel Crawford. I own this property." "What the hell is going on here?" Daniel's voice was sharp, anger bubbling beneath his shock. A pause. "You must be mistaken. This property belongs to the Swansons. If you don't have business here, I suggest you leave before we involve security." "Excuse me," Daniel snapped. "This is my land. I've owned it for years. I don't know who these Swansons are, but they have no right to be here." The line clicked off without a response. Daniel clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. He stared up at the mansion, its towering facade almost mocking him, and felt a surge of helpless rage. Determined to get answers, Daniel walked around the perimeter of the fence, scanning for any sign of his old home. The familiar pine trees that had once bordered his yard were gone, replaced by pristine landscaping and ornamental shrubs. The remnants of his life, the house, the garden, the small shed he'd built had been erased without a trace. It was as though he had never lived here. As he circled back to the gate, a black SUV pulled up on the other side. Out stepped a well-dressed man in his 40s, accompanied by a woman in designer sunglasses and a tailored suit. The couple exuded wealth and entitlement, their demeanor one of complete confidence. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his tone laced with condescension as he approached the gate. "This is my land," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "I don't know who you are or why you're here, but you're trespassing. I'm going to need you to explain what's going on." The man exchanged a glance with the woman, smirking slightly. "I'm Blake Swanson. My wife Marcy and I purchased this property legally several months ago. I don't know what you're trying to pull, but this land has been ours since the sale was finalized." "There was no sale," Daniel shot back. I never sold my property. I've been out of the country for work, but this land has been in my name for years. Blake raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. Maybe you should check your records. The deal went through the proper channels. If you have an issue, I suggest you take it up with your lawyer. Marcy added with a dismissive wave, honestly, we've put a lot into this project. If you're looking for some kind of payout, I suggest you save yourself the embarrassment and move along. Daniel felt his chest tighten with fury. These people didn't just claim ownership of his land, they acted as though they had every right to it, as though he were the intruder. You can't just bulldoze someone's home and pretend it never existed, he spat. Blake crossed his arms. As far as we're concerned, there was nothing here but an empty plot when we bought it. If you have a problem, get your lawyer involved. Otherwise, you're trespassing. The word hit Daniel like a slap. Trespassing on his land. Before he could respond, Marcy pressed a button on her phone, and the gates began to close. Goodbye, Mr. Crawford, she said, her tone dripping with mock politeness. Daniel stood there as the gates clanged shut in his face. His mind raced with questions, anger, and a gnawing sense of betrayal. How had this happened? Who had authorized this? And most importantly, how was he going to reclaim what was rightfully his? One thing was certain, Daniel Crawford wasn't going to back down. This was his land, his home, and no one had the right to take it from him. The shock of what Daniel Crawford had seen on his property stayed with him long after he drove away. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel. The mansion's looming image burned into his mind. He couldn't comprehend how everything he'd worked so hard for, his home, his land, had been taken from him without his knowledge. The smug faces of Blake and Marcy Swanson replayed in his thoughts, their entitled tone fueling his anger. Daniel knew one thing for certain: he needed answers, and he needed them now. His first stop was the local county records office. He parked his car hastily and stormed inside, his pulse hammering in his ears. The clerk at the front desk, a woman in her 50s with glasses perched on her nose, looked up at him with mild curiosity as he approached. I need information on a property, Daniel said, struggling to keep his voice steady. My property. It's been sold. But I never authorized anything. The clerk adjusted her glasses, her professional demeanor kicking in. What's the address? She asked, pulling up her computer screen. Daniel quickly recited it, tapping his fingers on the counter as she typed. A frown crept onto her face as the results loaded. It looks like the property was sold about 6 months ago, she said, scanning the screen. To a Mr. and Mrs. Swanson. The deed transfer and sale are on record. Daniel felt his stomach drop. That's impossible, he said. I never sold it. I've been out of the country for 6 months, and this land has been in my name for years. The clerk tilted her head. Well, according to the documents here, you did sell it. There's a notarized deed transfer with your signature on it. The sale price is listed, and everything seems to be in order. Do you want a copy of the file? Yes, Daniel snapped. I need to see everything. She printed the documents and handed them to him. Daniel's eyes scanned the pages quickly, his heart pounding harder with every word. There was his name, his property address, and a signature at the bottom of the deed transfer that was supposed to be his. Except it wasn't. He recognized the shaky, mismatched lines of the forgery immediately. The signature didn't look anything like his, but the casual observer might not notice the difference. This is fake, Daniel said, holding up the paper. I didn't sign this. The clerk looked sympathetic but shrugged. I'm afraid there's nothing I can do about that here. If you believe this was a fraudulent sale, you'll need to contact an attorney. They can guide you on the next steps. Frustrated but determined, Daniel left the office and immediately called a lawyer. He was referred to a property attorney named Ellen Harper, who agreed to meet him the following day. The rest of the evening was a blur of anger and confusion. Daniel sat at the small motel where he had booked a room, going over the documents again and again, trying to piece together how this had happened. His land had been stolen, and it seemed like every official channel had accepted the theft as legitimate. The next morning, Daniel met Ellen at her downtown office. She was sharp and no-nonsense, with piercing blue eyes and a crisp suit that radiated authority. He laid out the documents on her desk, recounting everything he had discovered so far. "This is clearly a forgery," Daniel said, jabbing a finger at the signature. "I never signed this. I was overseas when this sale supposedly happened." Ellen examined the documents carefully, her expression unreadable. "You're right," she said after a moment. "This doesn't look legitimate. But proving forgery isn't easy, especially when it comes to real estate transactions. The notary's stamp is on the deed, which means someone went to great lengths to make this look authentic." "Can't we just report it to the police?" Daniel asked. "We will," Ellen replied. "But I'm going to be honest with you, cases like this are complicated. It's not just about proving the signature is fake. We have to untangle the entire chain of events, figure out who was involved, and identify every step where the process went wrong. That takes time, and in the meantime, the Swansons are sitting pretty on your property." Daniel clenched his fists. "So what do we do?" "First," Ellen said, "we file a notice of dispute with the county recorder's office. That will put a legal hold on the property, which means they won't be able to sell it or take out loans against it while this is being investigated. Then, we'll start digging into the details. I'll reach out to the notary listed on the deed to verify their involvement. You'll need to provide as much documentation as possible, proof of your ownership, your whereabouts during the sale, anything that can strengthen your case." Daniel nodded, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time since this nightmare began. He handed Ellen copies of his original deed, tax records, and even his travel documents to prove he had been overseas at the time of the supposed sale. "Good," Ellen said, gathering the papers into a neat stack. "I'll get started on this today. But be prepared, Daniel. These things don't resolve quickly, and if the Swansons are as well connected as they seem, they're not going to back down without a fight." Daniel left Ellen's office with a renewed sense of purpose, but also with the weight of the battle ahead pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew this wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't about to let anyone take what was his. That evening, Daniel drove back to the edge of his property, parking just out of sight of the security cameras. He couldn't bring himself to leave without at least trying to get a closer look. Under the cover of dusk, he crept along the perimeter of the fence, scanning the mansion and its grounds. Lights glowed warmly from the windows, and the sound of laughter carried faintly through the air. The Swansons were entertaining guests, completely oblivious or indifferent to the chaos they had brought into Daniel's life. As he moved further along the fence, Daniel noticed something that made his blood boil. His old tool shed, which he had built with his own hands, was still standing on the far edge of the property. It was the only remnant of his past life that hadn't been erased by the mansion's construction. But instead of being left intact, it had been turned into some kind of storage area. Lawn equipment and patio furniture were piled haphazardly inside, as though it were nothing more than an afterthought. It was the final insult. Daniel swore under his breath and turned to leave, his resolve hardening with every step. The Swansons might have taken over his land, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about principle, about standing up for what was right. Daniel Crawford wasn't going to let them win. Daniel Crawford knew that filing a legal dispute would slow down the Swansons' plans, but it wouldn't stop them. The sight of his property, desecrated and reshaped into someone else's playground, burned in his mind. He couldn't shake the smug look on Blake Swanson's face or the dismissive wave of Marcy's hand as if he were nothing more than a nuisance. This wasn't just about reclaiming his land, it was about stopping them from acting like they could steal whatever they wanted without consequences. Ellen Harper, his attorney, had been clear the fight would be uphill. Forged signatures, shady notaries, and corrupt local systems could take months, if not years, to unravel. The legal dispute would block the Swansons from selling or refinancing the property, but it didn't mean they had to leave. Daniel understood the stakes. What he needed now was evidence proof of how deeply the fraud ran and who had orchestrated it. He started with the notary listed on the deed transfer. Ellen had reached out officially, but Daniel, impatient and restless, decided to investigate on his own. After hours of scouring online forums and public records, he tracked down the notary's office, a small, nondescript place on the outskirts of the county. When he arrived, the building was locked and dark, a for lease sign taped to the window. The business had apparently shut down months ago. Something didn't sit right with him. Why would the Swansons, a wealthy, well-connected couple, use a now-defunct notary office for such a significant transaction? Daniel snapped a picture of the sign and the building for Ellen before driving away, his frustration mounting. Back at the motel, Daniel received a call from Ellen. "I've been digging into the title company involved in the sale," she said, her voice brisk. "And there's something fishy. The company exists, but it's registered under a holding group with no clear ownership. It's a shell, probably created just to process fraudulent deals like this." Daniel's jaw tightened. So this isn't their first time pulling something like this? "Likely not," Ellen replied. "I'm working to connect the dots, but it's clear the Swansons or whoever's backing them have experience in manipulating property transactions. This isn't just about your land, Daniel. It's bigger than that." Her words hung in the air, ominous and heavy. He thanked her and hung up, but the idea that his case was part of a larger scheme unsettled him. It also made him more determined. Later that evening, Daniel decided to take a risk. He returned to the edge of his property, this time under the cover of night. The security cameras mounted on the gates weren't particularly sophisticated. He designed far more complex systems in his engineering work. Keeping to the shadows, he approached the back side of the mansion, where a cluster of tall trees still stood. It was one of the few parts of the property that hadn't been landscaped to oblivion. As he crept closer, he noticed something strange: small, faintly glowing stakes driven into the ground, evenly spaced around the perimeter of the yard. They weren't there the last time he had visited. Crouching down, he inspected one of the stakes and saw tiny wires running from its base, disappearing into the earth. It looked like a surveyor's tool, but more advanced, something designed for precision mapping or monitoring. He pulled out his phone to take a photo, careful not to disturb the equipment. Who was setting up this kind of technology and why? Was this the Swansons, or someone working behind the scenes? The stakes gave him an uneasy feeling, as if his land was being prepared for something far more extensive than a single mansion. As he made his way back toward his car, Daniel spotted movement near the mansion. Two figures stood on the patio, speaking in low voices. He froze, crouching behind the trunk of a tree to remain hidden. The voices carried faintly through the still night air. "We need to keep this quiet," one of the figures said. A man's voice, low and clipped. "If he makes too much noise, we're going to have a problem. Just handle it." The other figure, a woman, nodded. "I'll deal with him. But if he pushes this to court, we'll have to escalate." Daniel's stomach churned. They were talking about him, there was no doubt about it. He stayed still until the figures retreated into the house, then slipped back to his car. His mind raced as he drove away. Who were these people? They didn't sound like Blake or Marcy Swanson, and the fact that they were discussing him so openly made it clear they had far more at stake than just one property. The next morning, Daniel met Ellen in her office and told her everything he'd seen and overheard. Her expression grew more serious with each detail. "This confirms what I've suspected," she said. "The Swansons aren't working alone. They're just the front for a much bigger operation. Those stakes you found sound like advanced surveying equipment, probably used to map out the land for future development. If this group has already started planning for expansion, they're not going to give up easily." Daniel leaned forward in his chair. "What do we do?" Ellen took a deep breath. "We double down. I'll subpoena the title company and the notary records to trace the transactions. In the meantime, I need you to keep documenting everything: photos, recordings, anything unusual. We'll need every shred of evidence to build a case." Daniel agreed, though the thought of waiting and watching while his land was carved up left him restless. Over the next few days, he returned to the property at different times, observing from a distance. Each time, he noticed something new: workers bringing in equipment, trucks hauling away materials, and the stakes multiplying across the landscape. One afternoon, he spotted Blake Swanson overseeing a group of contractors near the pool. Daniel couldn't hear what was being said, but Blake's body language was animated, his gestures sharp and commanding. It was clear he wasn't just a passive homeowner, he was directly involved in whatever plans were unfolding. But the most chilling discovery came a few nights later. Daniel was reviewing photos he'd taken of the stakes in the mansion when he noticed something in the background of one image, a figure standing near the tree line, watching him. The person was partially obscured by shadows, but their presence was unmistakable. Daniel's pulse quickened. Had they seen him? How long had they been standing there? He checked the rest of the photos, but the figure appeared only once, as if they'd vanished moments later. He forwarded the image to Ellen, who called him immediately. "This is getting dangerous," she said. "If they know you're watching, they could retaliate. I'm going to request an emergency order to freeze any further construction on the property. But you need to be careful, Daniel. These people aren't just thieves, they're calculating, and they're not going to let this go without a fight." Her warning stayed with him as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of his motel room. For the first time, the weight of what he was up against began to sink in. This wasn't just about a mansion or a patch of land. It was about power, control, and the lengths people would go to protect their interests. Daniel wasn't sure where this road would lead, but one thing was clear: he couldn't afford to back down. Not now. Not ever. Daniel Crawford's sense of unease only grew in the days that followed. The stakes he had seen on his property were multiplying, spreading like an invasive species across the land. Each time he returned to observe from a distance, there was new activity: surveying equipment, trucks offloading materials, and workers who appeared to be marking out additional areas for construction. It was no longer just about the Swansons and their mansion, it was about something far bigger. The property wasn't just being stolen, it was being prepared for a massive transformation. Ellen Harper's legal actions were beginning to disrupt the Swansons' plans, but Daniel could tell that they weren't worried. If anything, they seemed emboldened. Blake Swanson had begun walking the property with an air of defiance, occasionally glancing toward the tree line where Daniel often watched. It was as if he knew Daniel was there and didn't care. It was infuriating. The freeze order Ellen filed to halt all construction activities on the land had finally been approved by the court, but Daniel suspected the Swansons wouldn't adhere to it. His suspicions were confirmed when, 2 days later, he spotted workers digging trenches near the mansion, despite the legal restriction. Ellen had warned him not to confront anyone directly, but Daniel's patience was wearing thin. He felt like he was watching his land be systematically dismantled piece by piece. When he sent Ellen photos of the workers breaking the freeze order, she promised to escalate the matter in court. But even as she reassured him, Daniel could hear the frustration in her voice. The wheels of justice moved too slowly to match the speed of whatever the Swansons and their backers were doing. Later that week, Daniel received a call from one of the private investigators Ellen had hired to look into the title company and the notary. The man's tone was grave. "Mr. Crawford, I think we're starting to uncover the bigger picture here, but it's not good. The title company that processed the sale of your land has ties to a development group that's been implicated in several similar cases across the state. They use shell companies to acquire properties, often through forged documents or coercion, and then flip the land for major developments. Your property isn't an isolated incident, it's part of a much larger operation." Daniel gripped his phone tighter. "So this isn't just about the Swansons." "No," the investigator said. "The Swansons are likely just a front figureheads who make it look like a legitimate private purchase. The real players are behind the scenes. This development group has a history of targeting landowners who can't fight back, using fraudulent means to force them out. You're not their typical victim. Which is why they're facing resistance. But I need you to understand, these people don't play fair. They've buried others in legal battles until they gave up, or worse, disappeared altogether." Daniel's stomach churned. The weight of the situation felt heavier with every word. He thanked the investigator and hung up, his mind racing. He had always suspected the Swansons weren't acting alone, but now he had confirmation. The stakes were higher than he'd imagined, and the people he was up against were dangerous. The next day, Ellen called with another update. "The notary listed on your deed is a ghost," she said bluntly. "They don't exist. The name and license number were fabricated. It's a fake identity used to rubber stamp fraudulent transactions. This means the deed transfer was completely illegal, but proving it in court will require more evidence. We're getting closer." But they're trying to stay one step ahead of us. Daniel clenched his jaw. What can we do to stop them? We're filing an emergency injunction to reinforce the freeze order and stop any further activity on the land, Ellen said. But Daniel, you need to be careful. These people know we're closing in, and they won't take it lightly. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The stakes he had found, the ghost notary, the mysterious development group, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle that were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was terrifying. He stared at the ceiling, his mind replaying everything he'd learned. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that every move he made was under scrutiny. In the early hours of the morning, Daniel's phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. Stay out of this, or you'll regret it. His blood ran cold. He stared at the message, his pulse pounding in his ears. The threat wasn't subtle, and it confirmed what he already suspected: whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until they had silenced him. Determined not to back down, Daniel forwarded the message to Ellen and the investigator. Ellen responded immediately, urging him to report it to the police. But Daniel knew better. The local authorities were either complicit or too powerless to stand up to the people pulling the strings. He couldn't rely on them. Instead, he decided to take matters into his own hands. The next day, he drove to a nearby town and purchased a trail camera, the kind used by hunters to track wildlife. He installed it near the perimeter of his property, hidden in the trees where it could capture any activity around the stakes and the workers. If they were going to keep breaking the freeze order, he needed proof. 2 nights later, the camera captured more than he expected. When Daniel retrieved the footage, he saw a group of men working under the cover of darkness. They weren't just breaking the freeze order, they were digging deep trenches and laying cables. The wires snaked across the land, connecting to some of the glowing stakes he had seen before. It was clear they were preparing for something far larger than a single mansion. Daniel showed the footage to Ellen, who was both alarmed and frustrated. "This is blatant defiance of the court order," she said. "We'll use this in court, but Daniel, you need to be careful. If they know you're watching this closely, they could retaliate." But retaliation came sooner than expected. The very next day, Daniel returned to the motel to find his car's tires slashed. A note was left under the windshield wiper: "Walk away before it's too late." The message was clear. They weren't just threatening him, they were escalating. Daniel felt a mix of anger and fear. For the first time, he wondered if he was in over his head, but the thought of giving up was unbearable. He couldn't let them win, not after everything they'd done. Ellen urged him to relocate to a safer place, but Daniel refused to leave the area. "If I disappear, they'll take that as a victory," he told her. "I won't give them the satisfaction." Instead, he doubled down on his efforts. He installed more cameras, began documenting everything in meticulous detail, and started working with Ellen to bring the footage and threats to law enforcement at a higher level. If the local police wouldn't help, they would escalate to state investigators. One night, as Daniel reviewed the latest footage, he noticed something that sent chills down his spine. One of the men working on the property wasn't wearing the usual construction gear. Instead, he was dressed in a dark suit, watching the operation like an overseer. His face was partially obscured, but Daniel recognized him. It was one of the figures he'd seen talking on the patio weeks earlier. This wasn't just about land theft. This was something far more calculated, and Daniel was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. Daniel Crawford knew he was walking a dangerous line. The threats, the slashed tires, and the shadowy figures on his property confirmed what he had feared. This wasn't just a simple case of land fraud. It was a coordinated, high-stakes operation, and whoever was behind it wasn't going to stop until they silenced him. But Daniel wasn't backing down. If anything, the escalating intimidation only strengthened his resolve. The morning after finding his tires slashed, Daniel drove a borrowed truck to meet Ellen Harper at her office. She had been working tirelessly to push the case forward, but the mounting resistance from the Swansons and their backers was testing even her patience. "I got in touch with a state-level investigator," Ellen said, setting a stack of documents on her desk. "Someone who specializes in real estate fraud. He's interested in the case, especially with the evidence we've collected so far: the forged notary, the shell company tied to the title, and now the threats. But I need to warn you, Daniel, bringing him in will escalate things further. These people won't go down quietly. I don't care, Daniel said, his voice firm. They've already destroyed my home and tried to scare me off. I'm not going anywhere. Ellen nodded, clearly impressed by his determination. Good, because things are about to get messy. The investigator will be looking into the financials behind the Swansons' purchase. And I'll be filing a motion to bring these new threats into the legal proceedings. We need to show the court that this isn't just a property dispute, it's a criminal operation. As Daniel left Ellen's office, he felt a strange mix of determination and dread. The further they dug, the clearer it became that the Swansons were just the tip of the iceberg. The real danger lay in the people pulling the strings behind them, people with enough power and money to bend the system to their will. Later that evening, Daniel returned to the edge of his property. The cameras he had installed had already proven their worth, capturing workers breaking the freeze order and laying cables across the land. But he needed to know more. Why were they so desperate to hold onto this particular property? What was their endgame? He parked his truck on a side road and approached the property on foot, sticking to the shadows. The mansion loomed in the distance, its lights glowing faintly against the darkening sky. Workers were still on site, despite the late hour. Daniel crept closer, moving carefully to avoid detection. From his vantage point near the tree line, he could see several men standing around a large piece of machinery. It looked like some kind of industrial drill, the kind used for deep excavation. Daniel watched as the workers operated the machine, drilling into the ground near one of the glowing stakes he had seen before. They seemed to be carefully extracting something, but from his position, he couldn't see what. His heart raced as he tried to make sense of what he was witnessing. This wasn't construction, it was something else entirely. Suddenly, a loud snap of a branch behind him made him freeze. Daniel turned slowly, his heart pounding, and saw a flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Someone was patrolling the perimeter, and they were getting closer. Thinking quickly, Daniel dropped to the ground, hiding behind a fallen log. He held his breath as the beam of light swept past him, dangerously close. The guard muttered something into a radio, then moved on, his footsteps fading into the distance. Daniel stayed still for several minutes, his body tense, before finally crawling back toward his truck. He had seen enough for one night. The next morning, he shared what he had witnessed with Ellen and the private investigator. The investigator's expression darkened as Daniel described the drill and the cables. They're not just building, the investigator said. They're tapping into something. Utilities, maybe, or even geological resources. If they're going to these lengths, it's because your land has strategic value. It's possible they discovered something here, minerals, water rights, or access to energy infrastructure. Whatever it is, it's worth a lot of money to them. Daniel clenched his fists. His land, his home, was being treated like a resource to exploit, its value measured only in dollar signs. He had spent years building his life there, pouring his heart into every corner of the property, and now it was being gutted for profit. Over the next few days, the situation escalated further. Daniel's cameras captured more footage of workers digging trenches and installing what appeared to be underground conduits. Ellen submitted the footage to the court, requesting an emergency hearing to enforce the freeze order. But the Swansons' legal team retaliated by filing a counter motion, claiming that Daniel was interfering with lawful construction. Then the threats became personal. One evening, Daniel returned to his motel to find the door ajar. His heart sank as he stepped inside, half expecting to find the room ransacked. But everything seemed untouched, except for one chilling detail: a single photo of his old house, torn in half, left on the bed. He stared at the photo, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The message was clear: they could reach him anywhere. Daniel called Ellen immediately, his voice shaking as he recounted what had happened. "This is beyond intimidation," she said. "It's harassment, and it's criminal. I'm adding this to our motion. If the court doesn't take this seriously, I'll take it to the state prosecutor myself." But Daniel knew that legal motions in court hearings wouldn't stop these people. They operated outside the law, using their power and influence to crush anyone who stood in their way. He needed to fight smarter, to find a way to disrupt their plans without putting himself in further danger. The breakthrough came when the private investigator called him with a lead. "I managed to trace one of the shell companies tied to the title transfer," the investigator said. "It's connected to a major developer that's been buying up land across the state for a new energy project. They're using front companies to acquire properties quietly, and your land is part of their expansion plan." Daniel's stomach turned. "Energy project? What kind of energy?" "Solar and wind," mostly, the investigator said. "But they're also targeting areas with access to underground aquifers and mineral deposits. Your property must be sitting on something valuable, something they're willing to break the law to get." Armed with this new information, Daniel and Ellen began building a case to expose the broader scheme. Ellen reached out to environmental experts and geologists, hoping to determine what resources the developers were targeting. Meanwhile, Daniel focused on gathering more evidence, doubling the number of cameras on the property and documenting every suspicious activity he could find. But the developers weren't done with him yet. One night, as Daniel reviewed the latest footage, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A group of workers wasn't just digging, they were installing what appeared to be explosives in a section of the land near the old tool shed. Daniel's heart raced as he called Ellen. "They're trying to destroy evidence," he said. "If they blow that area, they'll take out any trace of what they've been doing underground." Ellen didn't hesitate. "Call the police. Now. This is no longer just property theft, it's a matter of public safety." Daniel made the call, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. He knew the developers would deny everything, would claim the explosives were for construction or some other excuse. But he also knew he couldn't let them erase the truth. As he hung up, he stared out the window of his motel room, his fists clenched. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But Daniel Crawford had come too far to give up now. Daniel Crawford sat in the courthouse, his hands gripping the edge of the polished wooden table. The air was thick with tension as the judge flipped through the stack of evidence Ellen Harper had meticulously compiled. This was it, the culmination of months of relentless effort, fear, and determination. Everything Daniel had endured, the threats, the intimidation, the loss of his home, had led to this moment. Ellen had presented a damning case. The forged notary, the illegal title transfer, the shell companies, and the evidence of ongoing construction, despite the court's freeze order, had painted a clear picture of corruption and fraud. On top of that, the footage Daniel had captured of workers installing explosives on the land had shifted the case from a property dispute to a matter of criminal liability. The Swansons' lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, had tried every trick in the book to downplay the accusations. He argued that the Swansons were innocent buyers duped by bad actors in the title process. He dismissed the construction as routine landscaping and claimed the explosives were part of soil stabilization efforts. But Ellen countered each point with precision, methodically dismantling their defense. Finally, the judge looked up, his expression unreadable. "This case presents clear evidence of fraudulent activity," he began, his voice steady but firm. "The deed transfer was executed under false pretenses, using forged documents and a fictitious notary. The construction activities on the property were carried out in direct violation of a court-ordered freeze. Furthermore, the use of explosives raises significant safety and legal concerns. It is the court's decision to nullify the title transfer and restore ownership of the property to Mr. Crawford." Daniel's chest tightened as relief washed over him. He had won. The Swansons' smug confidence had finally been shattered. Blake Swanson's face was pale, his jaw clenched as he whispered furiously to his lawyer. Marcy Swanson, always poised and dismissive, looked genuinely stunned for the first time. But the judge wasn't done. "In addition, this court is ordering an immediate halt to all construction activities on the property. The individuals responsible for the unauthorized use of explosives will face a separate criminal investigation. And I am referring this case to the State Attorney General's office for further review. The court will not tolerate this level of misconduct." Ellen placed a reassuring hand on Daniel's shoulder, her expression triumphant but composed. "It's over," she whispered. "At least for now." Daniel nodded, but he knew better than to celebrate too soon. The Swansons and their backers might have lost this round, but people like them didn't just give up. They would regroup, find new ways to push back, and do whatever they could to salvage their plans. Still, for the first time in months, Daniel felt the weight on his shoulders begin to lift. The next morning, Daniel returned to his property, accompanied by Ellen and a team of environmental inspectors. The explosives were still in place, and the authorities had cordoned off the area for investigation. Workers had fled the site overnight, leaving behind equipment, documents, and traces of the illegal activity they had been trying so hard to cover up. As Daniel walked through what had once been his backyard, he felt a pang of grief for everything he had lost. The house he had built with his own hands was gone, replaced by the skeleton of a mansion that now stood half-finished and abandoned. The towering steel fences, the carefully laid landscaping, and the trenches carved into the earth were all stark reminders of how his sanctuary had been violated. But there was hope. The inspectors confirmed that parts of the land could be restored, and the explosives had not yet caused irreversible damage. Ellen assured him that the developers would be forced to cover the costs of demolition and reclamation. While the environmental team worked, Daniel explored the property, determined to reclaim what was his. Near the old tool shed, he found a stack of blueprints left behind by the workers. They detailed not only the construction plans for the mansion but also a larger development project that extended far beyond his land. The documents revealed the full scope of the scheme, a sprawling luxury community that would have consumed the entire area. Daniel's property was only the first piece of the puzzle. He handed the blueprints to Ellen, who immediately recognized their value. "This proves they were planning to expand," she said. "We can use this to push for broader investigations into the developers. They won't just lose your property, they'll lose everything." That afternoon, Daniel stood at the edge of his land, watching as a demolition crew arrived to begin dismantling the Swansons' mansion. The sound of heavy machinery filled the air as walls that had gone up without his consent came crashing down. It was a bittersweet moment. The destruction of the mansion was a victory, but it also served as a stark reminder of the fight he'd been forced to endure. Blake Swanson appeared briefly at the site, escorted by his lawyer. He stood near the fence, glaring at Daniel with thinly veiled hatred. For a moment, Daniel felt a flicker of unease, wondering what the man might try next. But then he reminded himself that the Swansons were no longer in control. The law was finally on his side. As the last section of the mansion crumbled, Daniel felt a sense of closure. The land was scarred, but it was still his. And now he could begin the process of rebuilding not just the property, but his life. That evening, Ellen called with one final piece of news. "The State Attorney General's office is opening a formal investigation into the developers," she said. "With the evidence we've provided, they're looking at charges ranging from fraud to environmental violations. This isn't just a win for you, Daniel, it's the beginning of the end for them." Daniel thanked her, his voice heavy with emotion. He hung up and stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. The stars above his property were as clear and bright as ever, unspoiled by the chaos of the past months. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt at peace. But Daniel wasn't naive. He knew the battle wasn't entirely over. There would be more challenges ahead, restoring the land, rebuilding his home, and protecting his property from future threats. But he was ready. He had faced down powerful adversaries and come out stronger. This was his land, his legacy, and no one would take it from him again. In the weeks that followed the court's decision, the Swansons' mansion was reduced to rubble. Daniel Crawford watched as the last remnants of their intrusion were hauled away by trucks, leaving behind only scarred earth and broken foundations. It was a small victory in a larger war, but it was enough to bring him a measure of peace. For the first time in months, his land felt like his again, even though it bore the physical and emotional weight of everything that had happened. The developers who had orchestrated the entire scheme were now under intense scrutiny. Ellen Harper kept Daniel updated on the unfolding investigations, which had exposed a web of corruption stretching far beyond his property. The shell companies, fraudulent title transfers, and environmental violations tied to the group were all unraveling under the pressure of state and federal investigations. Executives faced indictments, assets were frozen, and construction projects across the state ground to a halt. Ellen called one morning with a tone of satisfaction. "The Attorney General's office just filed charges against several key players," she said. "It's over, Daniel. They're not coming back from this." Daniel thanked her, but the sense of finality felt bittersweet. While the legal battle had been won, his property still bore the scars of what had happened. The towering pine trees that once shaded his backyard were gone, replaced by barren ground. The garden he had tended for years had been buried under trenches and debris. His house, his sanctuary, was nothing more than a memory. Determined to reclaim what had been taken, Daniel threw himself into the task of rebuilding. He began clearing the land, working alongside a small team of contractors he trusted. The first step was restoring the natural beauty of the property. He replanted trees, choosing fast-growing species to bring life back to the barren soil. He worked with landscapers to design a new garden, one that would honor the memory of what had been lost while creating something entirely new. As the land began to heal, so did Daniel. The physical labor, though exhausting, became a form of therapy. With every tree he planted and every stone he moved, he felt himself regaining control over his life. The Swansons and their backers had tried to take everything from him, but they couldn't take his resolve. One afternoon, while clearing debris near the old tool shed, Daniel found something unexpected: a small metal box half buried in the dirt. It was one of the only remnants of his original home that had survived. Inside were a few keepsakes he had forgotten about: an old photo of his parents, a set of blueprints for his house, and a journal he had kept during the early days of construction. He sat down on the ground, brushing the dirt from the items, and felt a wave of emotion wash over him. These small pieces of his past reminded him of why he had fought so hard to protect this land. In the months that followed, Daniel's property began to transform. The legal victories had drawn the attention of local and state officials, who praised him for standing up against corruption. Neighbors who had once been skeptical or dismissive began to show their support, offering to help with the restoration or simply stopping by to share kind words. But Daniel didn't let the attention distract him. He focused on rebuilding not just a house, but a home. The new structure he designed was simpler than the original, but it reflected the lessons he had learned. It was built to withstand the unexpected, with reinforced foundations and modern security systems, yet it also embraced the natural beauty of the land, blending seamlessly with the trees and hills. On the day the new house was completed, Daniel stood on the porch, gazing out at his reclaimed land. The garden was beginning to bloom, the young trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the scars of the past months were slowly fading. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to feel proud. Before heading inside, Daniel placed a small, hand-carved sign at the edge of the driveway. It read simply, "This land is my home. Trespass at your own risk." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. A promise to himself and to anyone who dared to try what the Swansons and their backers had. He would never let this happen again. As night fell and the stars emerged, Daniel sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the quiet sounds of the countryside. The fight had taken so much from him, but it had also reminded him of his strength, his determination, and the value of what he had built. The land was his, and it always would be.